another Sim Sculpting Sundays. Today we are actually doing Licoricia of Winchester. This is an individual in history that I wasn't really aware of prior to hearing about the statue that was unveiled in very recently, so February 10th of 2022. And essentially she was a Jewish English moneylender who was described as probably one of the most important Jewish women in medieval England. She first shows up in 1234. She was a widow. She had 4 children at the time, 3 sons and a daughter. And kind of throughout the 1230s, you can track her financing activities. She's kind of easier to pick out in the records just because of her name. It was pretty popular at the time, I guess, for kind of exotic names like Licoricia or I think Saffronia. There was a couple other ones that I was reading about, so kind of some unusual names that have not survived the test of time, but for her in particular, it made it easy to pick her out. So she was one of the top 1% of the Jewish population working at the highest level of financial dealing, so she was lending large amounts of money and was very wealthy. And her second husband, and she was also very intelligent, but she was canny, I would say, in terms of like the choices that she made. And for her second marriage, especially David of Oxford, he was the richest Jewish man in England. I didn't do too much digging on him, but comparatively speaking, the guy was very well off. He literally divorced his wife because he wanted to marry Licoricia, and hey, have at it. Just trying to see some other facts that I had about her. So in 1244, she actually got detained for a little while in the Tower of London as kind of a surety for the king's portion of her husband's estate after David died. And the majority of that portion, I think it was 5,000 marks and then 4,000 marks, were used to rebuild Westminster Abbey and a shrine to Edward the Confessor, possibly rebuilt that. My notes are a little sketchy here. But once she was released, she returned to her family. She continued running both David's business and her own enterprises. And for 30 years, she was a really influential business person. Like, she did all of the things. And there was a couple other notable peers in money lending, including Shira and Belia. I'm not sure if that Belia mentioned is her daughter, because she does have a daughter named Belia. Some of her clients were the king himself, so Henry III, his wife Eleanor of Provence, and even Simon de Montfort, like pre the Second Barons' War. One of her sons, Benedict, was the only Jewish guildsman in medieval England, and probably anywhere else in Western Europe, let's be honest. He was actually a citizen and could own tenements and houses. One of her other sons, Asher, this was with David of Oxford, ended up getting imprisoned in Winchester Castle at the point where Henry III was being kind of awful and trying to heavily tax the Jewish population, and there's actually some graffiti that he left there. We don't really know too much about what happened with some of her other children. She had 2 other sons, Cockerell and Lombard, and then her daughter Belia. And then in 1277, she was found murdered, and she was found by her daughter inside her own home. And they did indict 3 men for the murders, but no one was ever really convicted, and it seems like they didn't really try that hard to solve it, which is horrifying, but really paints a clear picture of how drastically things really weren't changing so much, but just like even someone who was incredibly powerful and wealthy couldn't get away from the prejudices of the times. They just kind of were like, well, have at it, which is horrific. And it's terrible that her murder was never solved, but by 1290, her remaining family at that point was banished from England due to the Edict of Expulsion, along with the rest of the Jewish community. And her son, Benedict, who again was at one point a citizen, ended up getting hanged for coin clipping. So, not great. But one of the things I find really interesting is, when we see these stories where we rediscover people in history that were incredibly influential and did things that you wouldn't expect to have happened, especially during the time, and you have this powerful woman who again, made lots of business decisions, was dealing with, basically with the king, probably wealthier than the king, because not all the kings were wealthy at that point. A lot of show going on, but yeah, and it's, I mean, I know for some people they didn't rediscover her or even discover her for the first time like I did, but I think it's interesting, and there's a book coming out soon about her that I want to read, and I based her facial sculpt entirely on the statue that was unveiled, which is actually located opposite where her home was at the time, as well as the 13th century synagogue. And I think it's interesting. I think she's an interesting person. I think her name is fascinating, even though I stumble over saying Licoricia quite a bit, but I want to know more about her, and that's the point of history. That's honestly how I got involved in history. I hated it in school. Hated it. And, you know, now that I'm no longer in school, I realize it's because the way history is taught, especially in the schools that I was in, was very much memorize this name, memorize this date, memorize this location. Here, you're gonna do a quiz. Here's all the locations you learned about. Which one was this one? And I don't learn that way, and it just made me really hate history a lot until I realized that these were actual people, that they weren't just they had a face but like no personality when you learned about them, and they had lots of personality. Heck, the founding fathers were incredibly interesting and nuanced and not so black and white, these ones were good, these ones were bad, like everybody was shades of gray. And that's not a bad thing. And it really bothers me that they, especially in schools, they're either not allowed to teach that or that they shy away from the fact that these were people. I think students in general would want to learn a lot more if they got the truth. Heck, George Washington, the truth about some of his teeth, because he had several sets, none of them made of wood. And just being honest about that and open about the fact that, hey, he did have teeth. They were human teeth in his dentures, and even if he bought them, like, how can you really consent to that kind of whole conversation? But we're coming to the end of the video, so thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed watching it and hearing a little bit about her, trying to be better about these things. And yeah, I will see you.